Welcome, folks. For those who are just joining us, we're going to get started with our keynote for the 2021 UW System Sustainability Annual Meeting. For those who don't know, my name is Brad Spanbar. I'm the Campus Sustainability Director at University of Wisconsin Oshkosh. We are your virtual host institution this year. Just as an order of business, please make sure that your sound is turned off during the keynote so that we can be sure that we can hear our presenter fully and clearly. So our keynote today is going to be presented by Dr. Carly Ziter. She is an assistant professor in the biology department. She comes to us from Concordia University in Montreal. Dr. Ziter is also the university research chair in urban ecology and sustainability. I actually found her contact information while reading a article in the New York Times about urban tree programs and its connection to sort of urban environments and its relation to social justice. And so I was very heartened to hear that she earned her PhD at Madison, and it was great to connect with her. And she thankfully accepted our ask to be the keynote speaker for today. So the title of her talk is Towards an Equitable and Resilient Urban Forest. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Carly Ziter. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for that introduction. And I'm going to just try and share my screen here and get set up. Okay. So I believe what you should all be seeing is my slides and not my presenter view. If someone can give me a thumbs up, perfect. Thank you for that. Um, So I am going to be talking to you today about urban forests, some of the work I do as an ecology researcher on the urban forest, and then ending with a little bit about uh, working towards more equitable urban forests. And a lot of the work that I present today is coming from uh, collaborations and colleagues that I worked with at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I'm going to jump back in time a few years and talk about some work I did during my PhD in Wisconsin, since I'm sure that's a familiar context for many of you in the audience today. So thank you to my lab mates, co-authors, a whole bunch of different community groups and organizations and residents who participated in the work that I did there. And as a little bit of background on me and where I'm coming to you from, I really got my start in research and developed my love for ecology as a field ecologist. So like boots on the ground, going out, catching animals, digging up soil, counting seeds. As an undergrad in Ontario, I was really fortunate to work in these incredible systems all throughout North America. And for my master's degree, which I did here in Quebec, I was exploring the fields and forests of what we often call working landscapes, agricultural and production areas. Now, when I moved to Madison for my PhD, I took a little detour and started studying ecology in the city. I was really fascinated with this idea of understanding the ecosystems where we actually live and work and play. So I transitioned to sites that look, a little less wild, a little more like this, in people's yards, on streets throughout the city. And I never left. This is where I and now my students continue to work, really still doing boots on the ground kind of field ecology, but embedded within the cities that we live in. And so that brought me to my current role where I wear a few different hats. I lead a biology lab here at Concordia in Montreal. The Urban Landscape Ecology Lab with a really wonderful group of students, undergrads through up to postdoctoral research fellows. And I also, wear another hat as a member of Concordia's Institute for Next Generation Cities, where we bring together researchers from very different fields to think about cities of the future and how we can build them better. And my role in all of this, along with my wonderful students, is to research what I like to refer to as the ecological fabric of our cities. So by that I mean, everything from parks to yards to vacant lots to street trees, where we use field work and also synthesis-based methods to ask how we can better understand, better measure, better manage these spaces, both to support biodiversity conservation, but also ecosystem service provision. So, ecosystem services here uh, basically just meaning the benefits people receive from our interactions with nature. So, how do we use our urban green spaces to create healthier, more livable cities? And another, maybe oversimplified way to think about this research program is that our cities, or more accurately, us, the people who live in our cities, need nature. We need nature to, reduce hot summer temperatures, to uh, control noise, to reduce flooding, to improve our mental health. And on the other hand, nature also needs cities, or nature needs us to manage cities with other species in mind. So we think a lot about how biodiverse our cities are, how the way we actually manage our green spaces influences other organisms, like pollinators or birds or other species. Today, I'm going to focus mostly up here on the cities need nature. How can we manage and use nature in our cities to make them more sustainable? And although we study many aspects of the urban environment, I'm going to admit that trees are my favorite. So, of all the things I study, trees are my favorite thing to think about. And luckily for me, trees play a really important role in shaping that ecological fabric of our cities, and in turn, shaping that livability, that sustainability of our cities. And many of you maybe have seen kind of infographics like this talking about the benefits of urban trees, that urban trees filter pollution, cool the air, reduce illness, manage stormwater, make your house worth more, all of these wonderful benefits we get from having a healthy urban forest. And that's partly because trees are, they're so large. They contain so much volume and biomass compared to other kinds of vegetation that they're able to really provide these outsized benefits across the landscape. So, part of what I do in my research and what many of my colleagues do in their research is to try and actually do a better job of measuring and mapping these benefits so that we can inform the decisions people make about the trees they plant. So what I'm planning on doing today, I'm going to give kind of an intro to some or an overview rather of some work that I did in Madison, focusing on how we actually measure these benefits. Where do these kinds of numbers come from? We'll talk a little bit about who is actually contributing to or responsible for our urban canopy. So trees are managed by an incredible range of people. So whose job is it to make sure we have all of these benefits across our cities? And then we'll end with a little bit more context on how we work towards what I'm going to call tree equity, ensuring that everybody has access to trees and the benefits they provide, which is currently very much not the case in the majority of our cities. And I'm going to start with a case study on cooling, which is one of the benefits that I spend a lot of time thinking about. Um, and if we're going to start talking about temperature regulation by trees, the logical place to start is why we need that temperature regulation in the first place, which relates to the urban heat island, a term many of you, I assume, have heard before. But the urban heat island describes the higher temperatures found in cities. So in the city, we pave over green space, we remove vegetation, altering the energy budget relative to surrounding areas. But you don't need to understand energy budgets or biophysics to understand or be familiar with this phenomenon because it's something most of us have experienced. Think about Standing in a parking lot on a really hot summer day compared to standing, out in a field or a forest or somewhere on a hike. And well, a few extra degrees might seem kind of nice this time of year. I just heard it was snowing in Wisconsin. Um, it's actually not so great overall. Heat related deaths in the United States outpace all other types of mortality from extreme weather. High urban temperatures also increase our energy use. They exacerbate air pollution. They cause a whole host of other issues in our cities that are really against the sustainability goals that we're typically striving for. Meanwhile, our cities are growing more crowded and hotter over time as the climate warms. And this is a worldwide issue. So even, up here in Montreal, which many people think of as a particularly cold winter city, we're facing significant increases in urban heat. So for example, back in our kind of baseline years in the 80s and 90s, when I was a kid, we would have about 8 days of the year over 30 degrees Celsius. That's probably about 85 Fahrenheit. By the time I retire from my new job, we will have 50 days of the year over 30 degrees Celsius. So that's a significant change in the temperatures we're going to experience living in the city. Now, of course, this isn't a new problem. We've known about the urban heat island for a really long time. We've recognized this challenge since before I was born. But much of the research on this has really focused on these urban rural differences. So the difference between the hot city and the surrounding cooler area. So kind of the city versus everyone else. So what happens when you live here in this bubble? How do we actually beat the heat if you live in the heat island? And if we come back to this article, I want to put the rest of this quote up here, which is that the rush to act is actually ahead of the science. This is becoming less true as time goes on, but decision makers want to cool cities down. We need to cool cities down because we are experiencing, significant illness and mortality from summer heat waves. But the best ways to do this aren't entirely clear, partly because so much of our research has focused on those urban rural differences rather than the city itself. And partly because even studies within cities often focus on what's called the park cool island effect, how kind of the size and the shape and the distribution of large green spaces like parks affects air temperature. And these kind of cool islands in the city are really important, but simply adding larger or differently shaped parks to an existing city is obviously a really big planning challenge. And beyond that, we know that our cities are really heterogeneous. Most of us don't live in a built up area or a park. We live somewhere in the middle. And so if we want to improve our climate adaptation strategies, our, urban climate action plans, we need to better understand how temperature varies at these scales that we actually live and work. So my colleagues and I wanted to think about how fine scale change in land cover might affect air temperature, which is a really important metric for public health. A lot of our fine scale temperature work focuses on land surface temperature because that's information that's available from remote sensing, for example. But it's much more difficult in some ways to do this with air temperature because you need to actually access those fine scale measurements. And we did this in Madison, Wisconsin. Usually this is the point where I would introduce the kind of city Madison is, but I think many of you probably know it pretty well. Fortunately, we had really good baseline data to work from. As work done by my colleagues in Madison shows that we do have a distinct urban heat island. So this image comes from interpolating between 150 of these stationary sensors. So these are sensors that are up on telephone poles all throughout the city. They were originally installed by Chris Kucharik and his grad student at the time, Jason Schatz. And a team of kind of intrepid grad students gets to climb up ladders and download and change the batteries of these a couple times every year. And then based on the amount of pavement or impervious cover surrounding those sensors, we can estimate what the heat island looks like. And so we can see Mendota and Monona here for context, and the kind of hot downtown isthmus. And it's a pretty distinct heat island. Now, we wanted to build on that broader scale work, which is thinking about the, kilometer or so scale, to think about really local scale mitigation, particularly by the urban forest. So, what can you do if you're working or managing or planning at a really fine scale in the city? And the reason that I look at trees is because the urban forest is something that is always changing. It's very difficult to replace pavement or build an entire new park. We don't do that very often, but we are constantly adjusting the tree cover we have in our existing landscape, planting new trees, removing trees, making decisions about species. Um, and so we decide whether to treat or remove trees in response to invasive insects. We decide on policies for tree replacement, where and what kinds of new trees are planted. How do we manage, planting below power lines or around infrastructure? And this means that decisions we're making today are really dictating future temperatures. We're deciding now what that kind of riskscape of the future is going to look like, because the trees we plant now are going to determine, tomorrow's canopy. Tomorrow being, several decades from now, canopy. And trees are also something people really care about. And so as a scientist, it's always nice to be able to connect on an issue that people are engaged in and passionate about. So one of our key questions here was how canopy, so as you increase your canopy cover, interacts with impervious cover or pavement to alter air temperature. This might seem like really straightforward. We already know the hot and the cool ends of the spectrum. It's going to be hot in the parking lots, it's going to be cool in the forests. But this overlap is still rarely addressed when it comes to air temperature. And that's because this kind of nuance is really hard to tease out when you have categorical sampling. So if I'm going to go out and put a sensor, in a park versus a dense neighborhood, I might miss that middle ground that makes up a lot of this overlapping area. So how do you measure urban temperature at a fine scale while capturing spatial change in all of these different explanatory variables? And on a grad student budget, I might add. So, I'm not going to go out and put thousands of sensors across the city. These are expensive, they're lost, they get stolen. So, in my case, what I did was I retrofitted my bicycle. And this is essentially a weather station. So, every second as I ride my bike, I can record the temperature, the solar radiation, the GPS coordinates, which are all saved to a data logger that's programmed within this nice box on my bike. And that means I get a measurement about every 5 minutes or so, or 5 minutes, every 5 meters, every 1 second in time, every 5 meters in space. Um, if anyone is curious, I'm happy to talk more about, the actual components or share examples of folks who have built similar things. This is something that looks like a little ridiculous. It's very MacGyvered. It's like a little wobbly. It seems like a strange way to go about doing like cutting edge science. But this kind of mobile sampling is a really good example of how new technology is innovating the way we do urban research, including colleagues who are using similar approaches, for example, to look at air quality. And I'll just show here, for example, there's another article that came out just recently from colleagues who used vehicles to study similar questions. So this kind of mobile sensing is increasingly catching on in urban spheres as a creative way to collect really important spatial data. This doesn't mean we abandon things like stationary sensors. Those are really excellent if you want to characterize broad patterns or change over time. But mobile sensors supplement that to let you get in and capture the fine scale and access kind of otherwise hard to study areas quickly and efficiently. You have a lot of mobility. Now, we sampled 10 transects, so all of these kind of paths here, multiple times each during the hottest part of the day over the course of a summer. So starting in late May through to early September, I would go out in the hottest part of the afternoon, bike these transects. And we did a subset of them at night. I'm not going to talk much about the nighttime data today, but you can always ask me about it. And I'm just going to zoom in on one example of this now. I'm seeing some comments in the chat that's dedication. I've never been in such good shape. It was an excellent way to get a lot of exercise while doing my graduate research. And so I'm going to zoom in on one of these transects over here just to show you what it looks like. Because I think the raw data is really compelling, and we don't actually share a lot of what our raw data looks like before we've gone in and analyzed it. And so you can see here from this nice satellite image, um, we go from a nice kind of canopy covered, forested park over to, a high canopy cover area, but with some roads going through to more of a residential neighborhood, but still with a lot of trees, getting into more of a typical neighborhood, larger roads, less tree cover, all the way through to the shopping mall parking lot here on the west side. And so you can see that just in the space of, a few kilometers, this would take maybe 15 minutes to ride my bike. We've covered an incredible range of variability in terms of that fabric of the city. And I'm going to color in this line in a minute based on this legend here, where we're going from 27 to 31 degrees Celsius. This is in the late afternoon on a summer day. You can think of this as about 81 to maybe 88 or 89 degrees Fahrenheit. So a fairly wide range of temperature as we go from blue to red. And we're just starting over here. And so you can see that these really fine scale changes in urban landscapes can result in really large fluctuations in temperature. If you were to go hang out in the park, you'd be almost, 10 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than if you're at the mall. But this is one of those bike rides out of, 85. And so how do we actually deal with all of this data? So as mobile sensors become cheaper and easier and more accessible, we're seeing a rise in this kind of sampling, as I mentioned. But the data is not always dealt with particularly well. It's a challenge when you have hundreds of thousands of measurements and you need to analyze them properly. So I'm going to go through a series of steps here to talk about how we did this. And what we got, because we were taking a measurement every single second, it's something like 1,500 individual measurements for each of these rides. And so what we did first, because we were riding, slightly different times of day, sometimes often on different days, we might have a shift in the background temperature from when we started to when we finished. We converted all of our measurements to a temperature anomaly. So for every measurement of temperature I had, I would say how hot or cool is it compared to this city center where we had some stationary sensors that were running all the time. And so I'd say, okay, I know the temperature in the city center, and it's generally I'm going to find a cooler temperature because I'm in, not downtown. So here, how much cooler was it when I was here riding through this park than it was downtown? So everything's relevant to a certain point. And then we looked at what's surrounding every measurement, so our environmental covariates. And we had access to a really wonderful data set from my colleague Tedward Erker at 1 meter resolution that told us how much canopy cover and how much impervious cover there was. And so we'd look at each point within a buffer surrounding that point. We could say how much canopy, how much impervious, and we'd account for the distance to the nearest lake because there's a lot of water in Madison. Water tends to cool things down. And we did this at multiple scales. So we looked at, a 10-meter scale. So that's about the size of one downtown city lot, out to 30, 60, 90 meters, which is more like the size of a city block. So this is a relatively local scale where you can imagine, individual decisions about planting or paving really playing out. So kind of yard scale to block scale. Uh, this is going to get statistical. And so if you want to, geek out about stats, this is your chance. If you don't really care about this, you can have a 2-minute snooze here. But what we did was we used general additive models, which are a type of model that lets you measure kind of non-linearities, so like wiggly data. And in these models, we put in all the things we measured, so canopy, impervious, how they related to each other, how far we were from the lake. We accounted for any sort of spatial structure in the data, so were our results just because we were in a particular spot? And we accounted for the fact that we had multiple of these transects that we rode. When you have something like a mobile measurement, you get a lot of what we call autocorrelation. So points that are close together just happen to be more similar to each other. And so what we did here, if you imagine all our data kind of stretched out in a row, we didn't use adjacent points in the same model. So we took the first measurement and then the 100th measurement and then the 200th measurement, and we analyzed those. And then we did it again with the next set of measurements. And then we did it again 100 times. And that's so that we were using all of that richness of the data. Once you've ridden like 400 miles, you don't want to throw away any of that data, but it let us avoid using kind of adjacent measurements in the same model so that we weren't dealing with this autocorrelated data. And we averaged those models to get our responses. And so that's what you're going to see here when I show you some results. You're going to see on the y-axis, the vertical axis here, you'll see that air temperature anomaly. So how hot or cool was it compared to the city center? And then on the bottom, you'll see either impervious cover or canopy cover. And each of these panels is just a different scale. So as we go from the yard to the city block, and we're going to step through this. So we're going to start down here with impervious cover. And remember, this is how we usually measure heat islands. We look at how much pavement is there. That's a really strong predictor of how hot it is. And so does that hold up? At the scale of a yard, as you increase your impervious cover, so if you were to pave your whole property, you get a little increase in air temperature, about half a degree or so here. As we measure bigger and bigger scales, that effect gets larger. So if you were to pave, an entire city block, you're seeing over a degree of increase in temperature. That's, what we would expect. More pavement, hotter temperatures. Now, what happens when we add canopy to the mix? This was really our goal, to understand how canopy relates to air temperature in addition to these impervious covers. And here, canopy has a cooling effect, which you might expect. So we're seeing a decline in temperature relative to the city center. But two things that I really want to point out here. One is that at every scale, the magnitude of temperature change is higher as we change canopy compared to impervious surface. So if we paved, this whole area, we would see about a 1 degree increase in our measured temperature. If we could get full canopy cover in that area, we'd see about 1.5 degrees drop in temperature. So at these local scales, you can actually offset that warming effect of impervious surfaces if you can get enough canopy there. Now, maybe the more important thing that we found in this data is that this relationship is really non-linear. So it's got a bend in it, particularly as we look at larger scales like a neighborhood scale or a city block scale. And so what we see is that up until about 30 to 40% canopy, we're not measuring much change on average. And then we really start dropping and seeing these strong temperature effects. And so this means that we have to get to relatively high canopy cover levels to really start seeing changes. Now we'll come back to this idea of 40% later. This is one study in one city. This doesn't mean that, in every city across the country, we need exactly 40% canopy. What it does mean is that there is probably some nonlinearity where as we get more canopy, we accumulate those cooling benefits faster. So I'm going to put those two things together now so we can look at that kind of full space between canopy and impervious. So this is as we increase our canopy. This is as we increase our impervious. All of these black kind of specks are areas that we had empirical data. So our bike technique really covered that space super well. What you're going to see as I increase in scale, this is looking at 10 meters, you're going to see these black points kind of move out of that top corner. And that's because at broader scales, you can no longer have a fully paved and fully canopy covered area. There's just not enough space for the trees when you have that much canopy. Compared to at a really fine scale where you can imagine, a road that has full canopy closure over top. And what I want you to pay attention to, I know there's a lot going on in these figures. What I want you to look at is the color difference. So as we go from yellow to purple, we see a larger change in temperature. So here at this 10-meter scale, the scale of a single property, you can actually make a difference in the temperature, about a degree of difference, just by adjusting your impervious or your canopy cover. But as you increase in scale and you get up towards, a city block or more of a neighborhood scale, suddenly we're seeing, 2.5 degrees of variability, where we're seeing really big shifts in temperature just by adjusting those canopy and impervious variables. Um, Someone's going to ask what the effect of the lake is, because I always get those questions and I haven't really been showing it in this data. And so I will mention here that the lake matters, but the lakes matter at a very local scale. And so the lakes are taken into account in all of this modeling and analysis, but unless you're really kind of walking next to the lake, you don't see a huge effect. It really trails off after, maybe 20 or 30 meters. So another thing I want to point out here is that this difference, this kind of 2.5 degree difference based on how we adjust our canopy and impervious, is an average across many days with very different weather conditions. If we were to look at just the hottest, calmest, clearest days, we see an even larger effect of canopy on temperature. And that's when kind of the health and the energy impacts are also most consequential. So we think that during heat waves, this is actually more important. And this difference is also just as big as those rural urban differences. And so, even though we tend to think of cities as kind of a heat island as a whole, really what we're seeing is kind of a heat like archipelago or island chain where we have these pockets of heat throughout the city, but we also have lots of cool areas. And we can contribute to those through our management. Now I'm going to just show you one image of the nighttime effect here. Even though canopy was really important during the day, at night, there is some difference. There's about a degree of difference there. But at night, removing those impervious surfaces is still really critical for reducing urban heat islands. So we can't actually just totally plant our way out of the effects of heat. We also need to think about our built infrastructure as well to reduce nighttime cooling, or reduce nighttime temperatures rather. So I've just given you a bunch of information about very technical measurements of heat in the city, but what does this actually tell us about where to plant trees? So just looking at this data, we saw that nonlinearity, pushing neighborhoods over that threshold, is going to give us the biggest drop in temperature, because we know as we get into those higher levels of canopy, that's when we really see drops. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing kind of targeted local planting. We did still see at those finer scales that even, you know, in a really small area, a few trees can make a difference. It just has less of an effect if you have low canopy around. So to me, what that means is that we need to be really, it means we need to be really particular about planting trees where they will matter most, at a bus stop where someone is sitting, along a street where people are walking, really focusing those fine scale differences. It also means that there's a real need for collective action. So, like, you planting a tree is great, but you planting a tree and your neighbor planting a tree and the school down the block planting 10 trees is much better. I also really want to highlight here that we can't forget low canopy areas. So, one way that you could interpret these results is to say, oh, we just need to plant more trees where we already have them. And I would really hate for my work to be used to promote that kind of like rich get richer attitude towards urban forestry. We know that urban forest cover often follows patterns of structural inequality, of systemic biases. And if we only focus on areas where we already have high canopy, we're going to further perpetuate those existing patterns rather than doing the work we need to correct them. And so the way that I interpret this is rather than just planting trees where we have them, this is a call to action to say, let's get all of our neighborhoods up to this threshold where we start seeing really strong differences if we can. And we're going to come back to this third point at the end of the talk and go into a little more detail about that idea of tree equity. But what I will say for now, one thing that I really appreciate is this rule proposed by my urban forestry colleague Cecile Kanijndijk, who proposes the 330-300 rule, which is kind of a play on, some of you who know trees will know the rules we have around planting, diversity of species or genera or families of trees. But in this case, he's saying everyone should be able to see 3 trees from their window, have 30% tree cover in their neighborhood, and live 300 meters from the nearest park. And what I appreciate about this is that it takes that local neighborhood perspective on canopy. We're not saying we have a target across the whole city, but we have specific local targets. I'll come back to this again at the end. So before I move on to the next kind of piece of the talk, I want to clear up a few questions here that I often get asked about this work. And we can talk more about them in the question period. But the first really good question I often get is, like, does it matter which trees we plant? What is the role of the biodiversity of these trees? So if we have a nice lush canopy like this, does it matter what the species are? And the answer is almost certainly yes, it matters, but for a few different reasons. So we still have a lot to learn about the intersection between tree diversity and the benefits those trees provide in terms of particular benefits. So there is some work, for example, supporting that tree species diversity can increase the magnitude of urban heat island effects. There are other ecological studies that show that diversity of species can increase ecosystem function. And that's a future direction that we're working on in the lab. So this is Matt. Mathieu is an undergrad researcher in my lab who has recreated a version of our temperature bike in Montreal in the lab and has been doing some preliminary tests of forest diversity effects. And so the jury's still out a little bit about whether at a particular snapshot in time, uh, tree diversity matters for temperature. It might not. But almost certainly where biodiversity is very important is sustaining our urban forests, is increasing the resilience of our urban forests. So we don't just want our trees to cool our cities now, we want them to cool our cities next year and in 10 years and in 50 years. And we only have to look as far as the emerald ash borer, which I assume some of you are familiar with, to understand that without diversity, our urban forests are at risk. And I really appreciate this piece from my Quebec colleagues that I think highlights the importance not just of species richness, but thinking of the functional diversity of our forests as well. So if anyone wants to read more about diversity, this is a nice read. But we can see, this example street that I've shown that is so nice and lush and green and cool looked like this a few years later because of the emerald ash borer. And so if we want resilient forests, not only do we need to think about canopy cover, which is what I focused on in the last example I showed you, but we need to think about diversity, which is something I'm going to get into in my next little kind of research vignette. So now we've measured an ecosystem service. That's given some insight into how many trees we might need to provide a certain benefit. We can look to ongoing research that supports planting a diversity of trees to sustain that benefit. So how many trees, what kinds of trees do we need? But who is actually responsible for all of this tree planting? And also all of this tree maintenance and tree retention, which is really important to note, has to go hand in hand with planting to make sure those trees survive. And here I want to show you just a simple illustration. So we're going to take a look together at an example of a residential area in Madison. So this was one of the places I sampled during the study I showed you. And I'm just going to highlight the tree canopy cover here. We have a lot of trees in this particular neighborhood. Canopy cover is quite high, but it's also governed by a lot of different stakeholders. So I want us to imagine what this neighborhood would look like without the contribution of private landowners. And we could just get rid of all these trees. It's really looking a lot less green now, right? So surpassing 40% canopy or 20% or 30% at the scales where we live and where we work is really unlikely and maybe actually impossible without both public and private contributions. Uh, Urban climate adaptation really requires all hands on deck. And so this got me thinking about this role of kind of land governance on the sustainability of our cities. And this is not something that is defined to Madison. This is true across cities. So here's an example from Toronto where 60% of trees are located on private property. I could pull up stats from cities across the world showing 50, 60, 70% of trees on private land. And I couldn't get this idea out of my head that private trees are so important and we know so little about them. So not long after I started my position in Montreal, I was really excited to see this article from a colleague at UQAM, University of Quebec à Montréal, where they were looking at forests on private land. So trying to collect more data on the types and numbers of trees that private citizens or institutions, like universities, for example, have planted. And so I contacted Alain and I said, hey, I think I have the same question as you. What do we do here? And he said, great, let's work together. And so we've been collaborating on trying to understand the role of different land use types in shaping our urban forest. And we can see a really great example of that here. This is the public tree data set of Montreal for a particular neighborhood. And it looks pretty comprehensive, right? There's a lot of little dots here on this map until you zoom in. And then you see what's missing, which is all of the private trees in people's yards or on campuses. And this is quite typical of many cities where we have done an incredible job, really a lot of work understanding our public or municipal trees, but that only gives us a small piece of the picture. It gives us a half data set. Now, we work with samples of data all the time as scientists. We never have all the data we want. So if we understand 50% of the trees in the city, is that really such a bad thing? That seems like a pretty good sample. And I think that really depends on whether those public tree data sets are actually representative of the broader urban forest. So are the public trees, in parks and in right of ways actually indicative of what we're planting in private yards, what we're planting on our campuses, where our choices and our motivations about what to plant might be very different. So, to fully understand the benefits of the urban forest, we really have to know what's there first. And this idea really intrigued a master student of mine, Kaylee Hutt Taylor, whose work I'm going to share now. And so she developed a plan where she was going to go out and she was going to knock on doors and measure trees across a variety of land use types. This was in early 2019 at the beginning of her master's degree. And of course, COVID-19 shut down the city about a month before her field season was about to start. So like many grad students, she regrouped and she decided that if we can't go door to door to collect data, maybe that data could come to us. So she combined some traditional field inventory in accessible places like schools and parks with a community science project to collect data from private yards across the neighborhood. So she focused on an area around our university campus. So in about a 2 kilometer area, she measured every tree in a public park, in the street right of way, in public institutions, schools, churches, and then she asked people from the broader neighborhood, can you go out take photos of your trees, measure how big they are, and then send us that information. We'll help you, identify them and convert those measurements. And she had almost 100 yards, about 90 yards that participated in this survey throughout the summer. And so this is still work in progress. These are some hot off the press plots for what Kaylee is finding, but a quick snapshot of what we're finding. If we look across her whole data set, private yards here in blue, we're looking, this is something called sample coverage. It's basically, as you add up, you look at all the data that she has across her whole area. What does our species richness look like? And you can see that private yards have significantly higher species richness than other kinds of land use types. And in her particular data set, 30% of the tree species she found were only found on private land. Um, I won't show the data here, but private land also tended to have a higher proportion of native individuals, which is a project an undergraduate has been working on in our lab. Private land had a much larger proportion of certain types of trees like conifers. So it's not just richness that's different, but some of the traits of these trees as well. So we think that these trees might be providing different services, different benefits to people, depending on who is planting and managing them. And so that data set of public trees is not necessarily representative of our whole urban forest. She also looked at the size distribution of these trees. And the largest trees, so the trees that have really high diameters at breast height, are in streets. So they're in our right of way. And that makes sense. You see these big, large trees across our streets where they're providing this nice canopy cover. And so well, certain areas might be contributing kind of outsized contributions to diversity. Other areas may be contributing more to things like canopy cover that depend on the size of trees. And so what this reinforces that kind of all hands on deck approach to urban forestry, where we have different amounts of cover, are receiving different benefits depending on the planting and management choices of different stakeholders. So that was kind of a glimpse into my own research where I think about, how do we measure these benefits? How do we use increasingly, creative ways to understand the structure of our city? And who is responsible for our urban canopy? How does the role of governance influence the distribution and the abundance of these trees? What I want to focus on to end the talk is this idea of tree equity, which is something that I've learned a lot about through engaging with the work of colleagues. And so I'll talk briefly about that, and then I do want to leave quite a bit of time at the end for questions and discussion. I know it's hard to listen to someone talk a long time on Zoom. So what is tree equity? We often think of trees as kind of nice to have. They're like a nice ornamental bonus after we've dealt with the important stuff in a city. And that, perhaps not surprisingly, as a tree researcher, I think that's fundamentally the wrong perspective. Trees are also critical life saving infrastructure. The same way our built infrastructure is important, so too is our green infrastructure, like trees. And American Forests, which is an organization focused on tree planting across, not just tree planting, focused on trees across the US, defines tree equity as having enough trees in an area so that everyone can experience the health, climate, and economic benefits. Um, that doesn't really seem like that radical of an idea, right? Trees are life-saving infrastructure. That means everyone should have access to them. But we are extremely far from tree equity in the majority of our cities. So this is just a piece of a canopy map for Baltimore as an example, where darker green represents high canopy, paler colors represent lower canopy. And it's pretty clear here that not everybody has the same access to canopy. If we think back to that 330-300 rule I presented earlier, certainly we are not meeting that 30% canopy cover in many of these neighborhoods. I can only imagine that many people living in these areas do not see 3 trees from their window, for example. And I could show you maps like this of many cities. I'm sure you can all think of neighborhoods in your own cities that have really high or relatively low canopy cover. And it's not only a problem that these maps show a range of canopy covers, but that these maps of urban canopy are really more often than not maps of race and maps of income. So if we look at again at this map of Baltimore, we can see the full thing now and the kind of scale here showing our canopy cover. We can see that it lines up strikingly well with maps of redlining, which of course are racist housing policies that have shaped and continue to shape many cities. And so the areas that were deemed hazardous are the areas that we still today see the lowest canopy cover, and areas that were deemed, desirable or best are areas that have very high canopy cover today. This is not something that is limited to Baltimore. This is something that increasingly researchers are analyzing across many cities. There's work from my great colleague Jeremy Hoffman showing 108 US urban areas and the effects of redlining on resident exposure to urban heat that shows that this is a nationwide problem. This is not limited to areas with kind of formal redlining policies or to American cities either. So here we can see images of two directly adjacent neighborhoods of my city, Montreal. So you can see the town of Mount Royal and Park Extension on the map here. There's literally a road right here that separates the two, where Mount Royal is just on this little corner here. And then we get into Park Extension. This is a very wealthy area of the city and one of the poorest areas of the city. And you can see that canopy cover is strongly shaped by wealth. So the exact drivers of these changes in canopy cover are not necessarily the same across every city, but they're often related to inequality, whether that is wealth or race or class or language, areas, structural inequality shapes our canopy cover. And I think it's really critical as ecologists, as natural scientists, that we start to recognize these underpinnings of the ecology we study. And I really appreciate this diagram from my colleague, Dr. Chris Schell, for visualizing this. This might be small on your screens, but what we're seeing here at the top is ecological and evolutionary patterns and processes, and then the kind of layers of the landscape that build up to create that pattern. So things like impervious surface cover, which can drive urban heat islands, green space and tree cover, pollutants, resource distribution. We know these things are spatially distributed, are heterogeneous throughout the landscape. And when you layer all of those different patterns, you get these kind of ecological patterns and processes that we measure. And for example, in the first study I showed you, I've taken a fairly standard ecological approach where I went out, I measured what was on the landscape now. I measured the green space and tree cover, the impervious surface cover, and its effect on urban heat, and related that to the heterogeneity of our city. And I think I did a perfectly good ecology study, maybe even an important ecology study. But a piece that was largely missing from my own work, from many of my colleagues' work, is what actually drives those patterns of canopy cover that we see in our cities today. And that's what we see at the bottom of this diagram, which is all of these systemic biases, the immigration policy, the segregation, the law enforcement, the gentrification, all of this structural racism and classism that sets up where the impervious cover is, where the green space is, where the resources are distributed. And coming back to this earlier slide, it's really critical that we think about this when we plant new trees. Trees take a long time to grow. So if we want to start closing this gap in who has access to canopy and its benefits, if we want to work towards tree equity, we need to start investing in lower canopy areas now. And this isn't necessarily an easy problem to solve. It's really easy to say, let's plant more trees, and very hard to actually change canopy cover. Cities face a huge number of stressors. I really like this diagram from Cavender and Donnelly that just shows some of the stressors like restricted root space, soil compaction, lack of water infiltration, lack of sunlight, heat from pavement. And a lot of these stressors might be exacerbated in low canopy areas of the city that might have, dense buildings close to the street or more soil compaction and pollution. So it will take a real investment on behalf of cities, but I think there are some steps that can be taken and increasingly are taken to get us closer to this equitable distribution of canopy. So, how do we move towards tree equity? I'm going to end with a few thoughts on how we move forward before our discussion. And I'll preface this by saying that I, an early career ecologist, am not, in fact, going to tell you how to dismantle structural inequality in our cities today. I wish I knew how to do that and that it was easy enough to cover in a 1 hour seminar. Of course, this is a very complicated area that will take a very transdisciplinary approach. But I do think that those of us who study trees, who are ecologists, who are natural scientists, who do measuring and mapping, have a really important role to play here anyway, even if we're not really grappling with the root of this problem. First, I think we need to think local in our planning and our policy. So this means moving away from city level canopy targets. I'm a landscape ecologist, and this is a clear example of where configuration matters. So things like temperature regulation, many other tree-based benefits are local scale processes. They're happening, at block and neighborhood scales. So having a high tree canopy for your city as a whole doesn't really say anything about equitable access towards those trees. And thinking about this at a neighborhood scale is really important. So I'm going to come back to this idea of 3 trees from your window, 30% tree cover in every neighborhood. Not across the city, not 70% tree cover in the rich neighborhood and 10% in the poor neighborhood, 30% across the board. So changing the way we articulate these targets is an important role that we can play. And to achieve this, we need high quality local data. So in other words, we need to identify the problem. We've been doing a lot of this step in the past several years. This might seem really obvious. I just explained that poorer, more marginalized communities tend to be lower canopy, but clear local data can help bring attention to that and stimulate action. And in many areas, we are still lacking good, clear information on our canopy. And particularly, we're lacking information on our tree diversity and on our non-public trees. So supporting more analysis of our tree canopy can help set goals and inform plans. And I really appreciate seeing that, the WDNR here talks about understanding patterns of environmental injustice in this work that they're doing. And once we have this data, we need to use it to inform planting or retention and management strategies. But a really critical piece of this is working with communities to understand what they want and need and letting those communities lead. So, good engagement is really critical to achieving outcomes that work for communities. And many organizations are increasingly realizing this. This isn't something we can accomplish from a purely kind of top down approach. We need to actually work with community leaders, community residents to understand how to get these trees where they are needed. So with that, I will wrap up, and I think we still have some time for questions and discussion. I also have my contact information here, so if anybody wants to give me a shout, by email or Twitter, you're always welcome to contact me that way. And otherwise, I would welcome your questions now.
Awesome, Carly. Thank you so much. I'm gonna echo some comments that I was receiving during your presentation from folks tuned in, and this is a very Siskel and Ebert review from someone on the call who said smart, accessible, and important. So 2 thumbs up And yeah, let's open up. We've got time scheduled until 12:15. So if folks have questions, please go ahead.
Happy to take questions in the chat as well. Oh, I see we have a hand there from Kate. Also happy to take questions in the chat if you want to write instead of talk.
So brilliant research, very relevant. I'm from Milwaukee, so this is a huge topic, and I've looked at the redlining compared to tree cover and so forth. So absolutely relevant. Whoever said that, like, beautiful work. And you also made me kind of geek out on some research that I have done and like totally threw me back and I haven't thought about in a while. I did research comparing land sparing to land sharing in Cuba, like looking at conservation after the fall of sugar in Cuba. So it really enlightened me into, I always came at it from a land sharing approach, which is essentially what this is spreading the cover out. And you talked about all the other benefits of the trees. Do you think that that approach benefits everything? And I'm thinking in particular, not that I want to deter from what you're saying, because I think it totally is the right approach for humans, but in terms of pollinators, bird habitat, like, how do you kind of balance your resources in a community to also have corridors? I don't know. It didn't seem like that's what your research touched on, but I was just wondering if you had kind of thought about those other benefits, and are they the same if you spread out versus collective large sections of land, which is land sparing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is something that we do think about. I have another student who's working on that land sharing, sparing question in cities. So I appreciate that you brought that up. So land sharing, land sparing, for those of you that might be unfamiliar, is basically, it originally kind of came from agriculture, where do we have like really intensive fields where we don't have very much kind of natural habitat there, but we kind of spare more space for nature outside? Or do we kind of mix things together? Do we share the space between, production and other forms of nature? So in a city, you can kind of think of this as densification. Like, do we have a really compact city and then we're leaving more space for nature outside, or do we kind of share the land? And there are a lot of really, really good reasons to densify our cities. Dense cities are, more walkable. They have a whole host of kind of social and economic benefits. If you look at like the sustainability development goals, densification is a core piece. And so one of the things I am really interested in is like, how far can we densify before we lose access to these benefits for people? And temperature in particular is a really challenging one, because once you lose space for trees, you really do start losing that local benefit. In other ways, things like having access to green space, or even we've done a little bit of work on air quality, some of these other benefits we can still maintain at pretty high levels, even in relatively dense cities, but temperature is really tricky. And I think part of the solution there is, are there non-tree solutions that can be playing a bigger role here? So thinking about, how much can we do through like green roofs or cool roofs? How much can we do through other kinds of vegetation, green? I'm going to actually put my screen back up because I'm going to show a picture. So we have a program in here we go. So we have a program in Montreal called the Ruelle Vert. It's a green laneway program, where this is a picture from a very dense neighborhood where we've taken an alleyway between buildings and added just tons of vegetation, not trees, but vegetation that presumably is providing something. So one of the questions that we are really thinking about in the lab now is, what are some of these other strategies that we can use where we can densify and provide benefits? And then also, the nice thing about trees is that you can actually have trees in relatively dense areas. Like you don't need a huge amount of green space, but we do need better kind of engineering solutions and management to make sure that those trees can grow well. And that's something that's a very interdisciplinary approach where, colleagues working on like designing a better soil cell to plant those trees in, that could be a game changer for canopy. And so I would say that in general, I think land sparing, like more compact, dense cities is a good thing to do, but we've got to be careful to not go like quite to the extreme where we're losing our green spaces, because that is going to reduce the quality of life for some people. And a lot of this work was really thinking about not necessarily like how do we build a new city, but what do we do with the land we already have? Like in a neighborhood that does have space, can we get that tree cover higher? But you raise a really good point that like getting these high levels of canopy in a dense neighborhood probably isn't possible in a lot of cases. And there are other benefits of that density that we should be considering. We don't want to just like sprawl out, endlessly in our cities.
Thank you. And what a great, this presentation allows me to think more about the research I've done and how relevant it still is to the work I'm currently doing. So just very enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think the sharing sparing is, I like to think of it more in terms of like a gradient of densification and like how far can you get down that density before you start to see some of those challenges.
That's a fantastic question. Really fantastic. Yeah.
All right, we have a hand up from Ashley.
Hi, Carly. I just want to echo what Kate had said. This was such an amazing presentation and so eye-opening to get at this level of detail. One of the slides that really caught my eye was the neighborhood classifications, and I think it was the Baltimore. I don't know if you're able to share that slide again. I would love to. I don't know that this is so much a question. If you want to speak more to that, I'm really curious, like what that would look like. Sorry, bias from the Milwaukee area.
Sorry, I'm muted here, trying to multitask. Yes, so I can share that slide again. So Baltimore is a particularly striking example. And I believe that these effects are probably somewhat less in the Midwest, if I'm remembering correctly, but definitely still there. And I'm sure you could find these maps for Milwaukee, for example, that people have done this work in a number of cities. And so basically what I would say is that whether the response is, equally striking in every city or whether it's exactly the same driver in every city, that's something that we're still teasing out. And like this paper here that looked at 100 different urban areas has more information, and I would guess looked at Milwaukee actually, although I don't know off the top of my head. So you can get kind of a fuller picture. But in general, what we find is that canopy is related to some aspect of structural inequity. And so here in Baltimore, for example, it's very strongly driven by race, by segregation, both kind of historical and current. In Montreal, where I live, the patterns are less strong in terms of race, but very strong in terms of wealth. And so it's not going to be exactly the same story everywhere, but we do know that these structural inequalities are a driver of canopy cover. Not in every single city, maybe not in the same way everywhere, but often enough that we really need to think critically about it. And some of this, I'm just going to pull up this example from Montreal, where we have the town of Mount Royal versus Park Extension. And some of this is kind of almost like locked in because of the way the city is built. And so what we were just talking about kind of density, often our poorer areas of the city, for example, tend to be more dense, have more pavement. And so you don't necessarily have the space. Even if you had the intention and the money to go in and plant more trees, you might not have the space to do it in some of these neighborhoods compared to areas where we have, larger green spaces, standalone homes with lawns. And so that's one of those examples where I think you might have to think of other kind of creative solutions, or of, are you going to go in and widen sidewalks and dig out pavement? Like, how far can you go here? But some of it is not necessarily like a physical space constraint. Some of it is either budget, which neighborhoods do we invest in? Which neighborhoods do we listen to? Um, so budget, invest in terms of money, but also which neighborhoods have the kind of social capital. If you think about who has the time and the knowledge and the social connections to, call their municipal leaders or their elected officials and complain about their trees and ask for more trees, and kind of the squeaky wheel gets the grease, that also plays a role in our current kind of tree landscape, where people who are able to get kind of attention and get investment in their neighborhoods are able to increase their canopy cover in a way that, if you're working 3 jobs and struggling to get by, and you probably have the time to be calling someone about the tree in front of your house, and maybe they're not going to listen to you anyway. And so that's where I think working with communities and really developing connections with community leaders and um, having kind of co-led programs is a really critical piece of this, because right now we keep investing in places that have already been invested in.
Thanks, Carly.
I can see we have in the chat something, a map from Philadelphia. Yeah, so there are some great, there have been some really great kind of investigative journalism pieces lately that go through this. So the New York Times has an interactive. These slides actually come from an article called Code Red, the Role of Trees, that focuses on Maryland in particular. But there are some really nice kind of accessible sources of data coming out on this as we start to kind of pay more attention to it. I think I have a question in the chat here. Have you seen any concerning trends in low biodiversity tree selection in the areas you've studied looking beyond ash trees? I think we've struggled to learn our lesson about planting the same type of tree over and over, which that's elm disease, emerald ash borer. Seems that acer or maple might be susceptible to a drastic canopy impact based on what I've seen. That's a question from Wes. Yes, so particularly in Madison, we have so many Norway maples, like endless Norway maples, and which are not particularly great trees. They get into natural areas, they outcompete sugar maples. They get, the kind of tar spot disease that looks really unattractive, and some of that is the challenge with trees, is that it's what we see now is a legacy of past decisions. So, for example, people say, well, why do we have all of these ash trees? And it's like, well, we planted them a long time ago, and now they're big and causing a problem. But I think you raise a good point here that we're not necessarily learning the lesson fast enough. I do think in talking to arborists, talking to municipal kind of planners or folks involved in tree planting, we are doing better with newer plantings in terms of thinking about the diversity of trees we plant. I think some of the things we see now, with ash, with acer as well, particularly in our area, it's Norway maple. In other areas, it might be something else. These are a legacy of decisions we've made in the past, often because these trees are really, they're really hardy. They do really well in urban settings, in compacted soils with pollution, and so in some ways we do have kind of a limited pool of species that do very well. But yeah, so I guess my short answer is I do think we're doing better now, but maybe not quite as fast as we need to be. And I do know there's quite a bit of work now thinking about not just species richness, but thinking about more, functional diversity. Or so if we're planting 5 species of maple, yeah, we have 5 species, but if we have some threat that targets maples, it didn't really matter so much that we planted 5 species. Really, we should have planted 5 very different species. And so expanding the way we think of diversity and how we manage that planting is kind of a big frontier right now in urban forestry and management. And so I am cautiously optimistic that in 50 years, we're not going to be in a situation where we're like, oh no, the honey locust borer has come and now all of our trees are gone, but we might be in some cases. We have a hand up from, everyone loves those autumn blaze maples. Yes, so I believe autumn blaze, is that a Freeman maple, like a silver red hybrid? Yeah, I have one outside my house and I have to say I do love it. It is gorgeous. But maybe we're planting a few too many of the same cultivars. And I'm gonna go to Jim, who has a hand up, and then I don't know how we're doing with time. If you all have to go, I see there's another question in the chat.
Hey, thanks so much for this. This has been just terrific. I've really enjoyed it. I'm the director of our environmental studies program at UW Oshkosh. So it's an undergraduate only program. It's very interdisciplinary. And that's one of the things I appreciated the most about the way you so frequently were gesturing to the ways that your work is intersecting with other components of a sort of an interdisciplinary approach. I also love the way that's embedded in community and community needs. And so my question for you is, how downscalable would you say your work is for undergraduate research and participation? I mean, I just love the idea of sending my students biking off around the city with MacGyver geo contraptions on the back of their bike. Is that something that you're able to, have you taken that sort of technique with you? Is that something that students can meaningfully participate in without pursuing in a course or in a semester long project without pursuing a PhD? But
Yeah,
thanks again. This is just such a terrific example of interdisciplinary community-embedded research in the name of sustainability at work, and it's really enjoyable. I was the one that texted Rad. We were taking advantage of Zoom meetings and texting notes to each other, and I was the one that gave the Siskel and Ebert review to him. That he started off the question and answer period.
Well,
so I'm really impressed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those comments. Those are lovely comments to hear for sure. Yeah, so downscalable. So I have had this conversation multiple times thinking about how do we kind of operationalize this in terms of community science or working with cycling clubs or getting students out there. And I do think there is potential there. It is something that I very much would like to do. Just to give a sense of time span, I finished my PhD in 2018, finished this work in 2019. During that time, moved back to Canada, started a new job. Then we hit a pandemic. And so things that I thought I'd have done by now, they're not done by now. And so certainly that's still on the radar. I have actually chatted a little bit with a colleague at the Wisconsin DNR who's really interested in this idea of kind of leveraging this work more broadly. And so I do think there is some potential there for getting more, either citizens or students or people involved in this kind of mapping. And I know other places have done versions of this where they've sent a bunch of people out. The challenge is, how do you work with that data, and it comes down to what your goal is with the data as well. If you want to go out and just kind of make a map and look at patterns, definitely you can do that on an undergrad level. If you want to collect data that is kind of publishable in terms of, really spanning clear, deliberate gradients and analyzing it really well, I'm not going to say that's not possible, but it's a different conversation. But in terms of an educational experience and getting students out and collecting the data, I'm sure there's ways you could do this with your cell phone and going out and taking temperatures. And so I do think it's operational. The other thing that is very can be operationalized at an undergrad level is some of the work that I showed looking at species diversity in different land covers. Ideally, my colleague and I who are working on that are working on a much bigger project and a funding proposal now where we would set up small plots around campuses in cities, all over the world, where students would go out and try and identify and measure, every tree in different land cover types around their campus. And then we would have this kind of global network where we could look at some of those patterns. And so that's a way where I can imagine, undergrads, whether they're in a field course or, doing a senior project or something, going out and getting involved and contributing to this much bigger effort in a way that really engages the community around their institution and then gets them out talking to people. And so I think there are opportunities. That is something I think a lot about as I kind of grow my research program, but it's the challenging part of doing one of the challenging parts of doing kind of interdisciplinary and community engaged research is that it is slow to kind of get things off the ground and build those relationships. And so I do hope to continue in that direction though. And so I think there are certainly ways to get students involved.
I'm glad to hear it. I think it could be a really, really effective way of achieving a lot of those goals.
Yeah, and I'm always happy to chat if you have ideas about your program and you want to throw me an email, and I'm happy to set up a meeting and talk.
Thank you for that. Yeah,
anytime.
I'm going to take you up on that. Thank you.
Okay, do I have time to very quickly address Arena's question, or are we past time here?
We're a little past, but let's go for it, and then we'll excuse people to lunch.
Okay, so avoiding gentrification should be a priority when shaping urban green spaces. Greening of communities should aim to naturalize the withdrawal of working class people. Communities not become targets for upscale developments. How do you think microscale plans could be achieved in these cases? So ideas for community engagement and planning that address environmental and social justice. That is such a great question, such an important question, a really big question that I'm not going to have a super good answer for. I think in general, gentrification is a huge challenge when it comes to urban greening, because we know that coming in and doing particularly like showy, fancy greening projects really does drive up, rent prices, home prices. We risk people being, pushed out of the neighborhoods. The people that were in need of and deserved that greening are then maybe pushed out, and that's absolutely not the intention with greening projects. And so there are a few different ways I think to approach this in my conversations with people who know more about this than I do. The things that I see are, first of all, how are you implementing that greening? And so are you working, with the community to see what they want and need? And are there ways that you can green for function in a way that is not necessarily super kind of flashy or fancy? And so you could have, small scale greening projects that provide a lot of benefit, but that maybe aren't the really like attention grabbing, kind of money grabbing green projects. The other thing is that, we shouldn't be greening in the absence of kind of social policies and structures in place to allow people to stay in their neighborhoods. And so are we thinking about affordable housing? Are we thinking about rent freezes? Are we engaging with these potential mechanisms that allow people to stay when we've planned a big greening project that we know might negatively affect that area? And so I think it has to go beyond just the people doing the greening and really incorporate kind of the policies that are being put into place. But I do think there are ways we can think about how that greening is happening. Is it a community initiative where people are coming together and planting certain things or asking for certain things versus the city coming in and doing like a big fancy project with a big fancy sign that's then going to attract, builders and investors in that way. Yeah, so just green enough is one way that we describe that, where it's kind of like green enough to get the benefits without necessarily being so green that it is kind of increasing gentrification. And I always kind of struggle with that framing, because it does make me think like, oh, we don't want to give you the nice greening. Like we want to give you just enough greening. And I'm like, well, of course everyone deserves the nice greening. Like everyone deserves the good park. But I think there is something to that concept of greening for function and for what people want rather than greening for kind of attractiveness necessarily. Really good question.
Thank you, Carly, for your time and for your presentation. I think clearly this was very well received by this group and got a lot of folks thinking about, intersectionality of sustainability and social justice issues and environmental justice issues. Yes, the virtual applause I think is much needed. So thank you so much. I have a feeling you'll be hearing from folks about collaboration and that sort of thing.